Welcome to the Christian Life Bible College video series, The Bible in Stones and Statues, and Session 3. This week we're going to trace the rise of Assyria, the power to the north and east of the people of Israel. For those of you who remember the world before 1989 and the Cold War, you will know that the world was pervaded by a fear of an invincible army which was capable of wiping out whole civilizations. Such was the case of Israel when the threat of Assyria began to grow. Assyria had an emperor, Assyrian, and he built an army, a ferocious army which was to rule the ancient Near East until around about the end of the 7th century BC. So for 300 or 400 years, the ancient Near East was dominated by this aggressive, civilized, war-minded people. And nothing was too great for them to do in terms of the military. They cut their way through mountains. They had an army that was equipped like nothing else that had ever been seen in history. They wiped out all that went before them, taking people into captivity and putting them into other places as they built their empire. And the land of Palestine, with its fertility, had not escaped the eyes of the Egyptian emperors. So we're going to go into the British Museum and see Assurbanipal's frieze from his palace. We'll see how the Assyrians fought. We'll see their armour and the way they attacked a city, scaling its walls with their siege engines and their battering rams. We'll have a look at how the soldiers were dressed and what they did with their booty and their prisoners and their captives. We'll then move on and have a look at some fascinating details from the Word of God. Why, for example, does the prophet Ezekiel complain about the vermilion on the feet of people? What is that vermilion? We'll see from the frieze in the British Museum. In the museum, Assurbanipal's palace has virtually been reconstructed, and it's possible to see the famous frieze. In fact, there was 2 miles worth of it at one time. Part of the famous frieze is laid out on the walls of a large room in the museum. The detail is stunning, and it will take us back into the era of the Assyrians and see what some of the ancient Israelites would have seen with their own eyes. We'll then move on and have a look at the gates of Balawat, reconstructed in the British Museum, an example of the greatness of the Assyrian Empire. Huge gates for a city that was not far from Nineveh. And then we'll turn in our detail to what was going on in the land of Israel itself. Ahab's ivory palace, for example. Is what the Bible said about Ahab having a palace of ivory really true? Finally, we'll look at the Moabite stone, an exciting discovery made from the year 850 BC, where we see Mesha, king of Moab, talking about how he had victory over his neighbouring Israelite king. It stunningly brings that part of the Bible to life. We hope you will enjoy this session on the rise of Assyria. The Lord bless you as you do your work.
When Solomon dissipated all that David had built, God began to take measures to bring the people back again. More people come to know God through trouble than through tracts. And God raised up trouble in the form of this gentleman, Assurbanipal. His 2 predecessors had provided him with a strong platform. One of them had subdued southern Mesopotamia and Babylon. The other one subdued the countries to the north and left Assurbanipal with an experienced army and with a secure organisation. Assurbanipal became the rod of God's anger. The palace of Assurbanipal was discovered in a most amazing way. It was discovered by a young man, Henry Austin Layard, whose uncle had a tea plantation in Ceylon, and Henry decided he would get a job on his uncle's tea plantation. But walking over to Ceylon, he got stuck in Persia, fell in love with a Persian princess. Unfortunately, the romance came to nothing. Her father was defeated by another warlord, and this poor girl ended her days in a dungeon. Layard had all kinds of adventures in Persia. One man he dealt with, one of the local lords, used to get prisoners he didn't like, knock their teeth out, load their teeth into a blunderbuss and shoot them dead with their own teeth. There was war going on at the time between Persia and Turkey, and Layard got quite a lot of useful political information which he thought might fetch a nice price if he could sell it to the British ambassador at Istanbul. Making his way up to Istanbul, he came across a Frenchman, Emile Botta, digging in a great big mound looking for Nineveh. And that rather grabbed Layard's imagination. But he went on, met the ambassador, sold his information, and got a job with the ambassador. Worked as a spy and a war correspondent, had all sorts of adventures, hoping eventually to get a job on the staff at the embassy. But when the ambassador, Canning, had to go back to England for a spell, he borrowed 60 quid off him and went down looking for Nineveh. He had a terrible time with the local lord, where he thought it might be a useful place to dig. One day, the message went around that the local dignitary had died, and arrangements were made for his funeral. But suddenly the palace gates were flung open, and out came the Lord with his soldiers and arrested everybody who was celebrating. It was just a scheme to smoke out his enemies. He absolutely forbade Layard to dig anywhere. Everywhere was a holy site, much too holy for Layard to touch. But Layard tricked him by saying he was going on a hunting expedition and took some local workers with him and started digging in a likely mound. The very first morning, they unearthed 10 of these great slabs, and the workers were terrified. They thought the gods were coming out of the ground. Layard had found Ashurnasirpal's palace, a great palace, 640 feet long and 450 feet wide, with many, many vast halls, and the halls were decorated with these great relief sculptures, about 8 or 9 feet high, some of them. Across all of the sculptures was this writing. It's known as the palace inscription of Ashurnasirpal, and it gives us quite an insight into what kind of a man Ashurnasirpal was. Palace of Ashurnasirpal, the priest of Ashur, favourite of Enlil and Inerta, beloved of Anu and Dagon, the weapon of the great gods, the mighty king, the king of the world, the king of Assyria, the valiant man who with the support of Ashur his lord has no equal among the 4 regions of the world, the wonderful shepherd who is not afraid of battle, the great flood which none can oppose, the king who has subjected all mankind, the mighty warrior who treads on the neck of his enemies. I am Ashurnasirpal, the celebrated prince who reveres the great gods, the fierce dragon, conqueror of the cities and mountains to their furthest extent, the king who is crowned with splendour, the merciless champion who shakes resistance, the glorious king, the shepherd, the protector of the whole world, the king, the word of whose mouth destroys mountains and seas, who by his lordly attack has made fierce and merciless kings from the rising to the setting sun acknowledge one rule. Ashurnasirpal brought to scientific perfection, one of the world's oldest industries, robbery with violence. And he found all sorts of ways of beating people up. Here he is going off to battle, one of his campaigns. Every season the army would be mustered and off they would go, and in one season this great army, 120,000 soldiers, would conquer 60, 70 or 80 cities and bring the plunder back to Assyria. Here are a series of war engines. There are three of them, one behind the other. In the front, there's a battering ram with a team of soldiers inside. They would swing the bronze or iron-headed ram back and forward, bashing against the wall. Behind that is a tower from which the commanders could see what was happening the other side of the wall, and behind that is an archer's tower. These siege engines would be collapsible. They'd take them to pieces, put them on bullock carts. There'd be dozens of them used in every siege, and they would be taken off to the next siege. Here, Ashurnasirpal is going into battle, inspired and led by the god Ashur, the winged god Ashur. Every campaign was a religious crusade. It was part of their religion, brought honour and credit to Ashur, and all the captured gods would be, all the idols, captured idols, would be brought back to Assyria. They came to a river, and the army would camp the side of the river, and the preparations would be made for crossing the river. Chariots would be taken to pieces and loaded onto rafts or great coracles called guffers, and the soldiers would get ready to cross the river. Here, scaling ladders, soldiers are climbing up the scaling ladders. Others are mining underneath the walls of the city. Here, the defenders have got a chain round one of the battering rams and are trying to tip it over whilst flaming torches are hurled down. At last, the city falls, and every man in the army's rich. Hundreds of captives, great quantities of booty fall into the hands of the Assyrians. You can see how ploughing, sowing and reaping didn't hold much attraction. This became like a drug, like a heroin to the Assyrians. There'd be the drama of the siege and the breakthrough. And then suddenly every man in the army was rich. Reports would be coming in from the next city. How many towers, how many battering rams would be required? Here, weeping women, children going off into captivity. Here, pathetic picture of a mother giving a child a drink of water. One of the few touches of humanity in these reliefs. Here, the enemy has been defeated in the field and they're swimming across on blown up skins. And in fact, that's a practice which continues today. After the successful siege, there had to be celebrations. And here the army celebrating the victory. Some of the soldiers are dressed up as demons or gods with animal skins. Others are playing, the army band is playing the latest dance tunes. Some of the soldiers are clapping their hands in time to the music, and others are banging together the decapitated heads of the leading men of the city. Here, a vulture is bringing in another head, a bit of sick Assyrian humour. They cut so many heads off, they used to make pyramids of the heads. There were literally miles of these beautiful reliefs recovered from the palaces of the Assyrian kings. Beautifully executed in great detail, but even so, they only formed a small part of the decoration of the palace rooms, a small frieze along the bottom, and from the plaster that's been recovered, it's known that the palace halls, perhaps 30 feet high. The walls were decorated with beautiful pictures of the gods and so on. Strange to our taste, that beautiful stonework was painted over in ancient times, painted in natural colours. Most of it has been lost, but occasionally where the earth piled against the foot of the wall in earliest times, the paintwork has been preserved. And that's rather interesting. Ezekiel chapter 23, verse 14, the prophet castigates the people of Jerusalem. He said, Jerusalem, she doted upon the Assyrians. She saw men portrayed upon the wall, the images of the Chaldeans portrayed with vermilion. And you can see that some of the vermilion, the red, about which the prophet was speaking. This is a most interesting object. It's a great slab about 10 feet wide and about 6 feet high, and it shows Ashurnasirpal. It's there in duplicate, and there's the tree of life. He's being anointed with symbols of fertility, the fir cone and water, and the god Ashur is giving him authority to rule the empire. The significance of this slab is that it stood behind Ashurnasirpal's throne. To give you an idea of the mind and the method of Ashurnasirpal, I'd like to read from the slab whilst we're looking at this relief. This is what he says after capturing a city. I slew one of every two. I built a wall before the great gates of the city. I flayed the chief men, and I covered the wall with their skins. Some of them were enclosed alive within the bricks of the wall. Some were impaled on stakes along the wall. I caused a multitude to be flayed in my presence, and I covered the wall with their skins. The Assyrians ran a kind of insurance society. We live in a very dangerous world. For a small premium, Ashurnasirpal will look after you and make sure that nothing nasty happens to you. City your size, £5 million a year, and you'll be all right. Ashurnasirpal will see you're all right. But when the army went away and time came for paying, people would think twice about the immense premium they had to pay, and hoping for the best, they'd keep the money back. Eventually, Ashurnasirpal would come, and what I've just read would be nothing. And he said that he completely destroyed the city, left it like a mound after a flood. The city totally obliterated. You'll notice that the artist has very sharply delineated the muscles in his pictures. The artists had plenty of specimens on which to study their anatomy. God had supported the Israelites against the next door neighbours, the Philistines, and given them victory there. But here was an army of 120,000 superbly equipped soldiers, disciplined, well-trained, who could march hundreds of miles, cross rivers and mountains, an absolutely unstoppable army. Could Yahweh cope with problems like this? We'll have another look into the mind and methods of Ashurnasirpal as we look at what are known as the Qarqar. These two slabs, like great tombstones, were found in the upper reaches of the river Tigris. They are the record of the campaigns of Ashurnasirpal and of his son Shalmaneser. Shalmaneser's was found first, and it said on it how it had been set up alongside the one of his father. So they continued digging and found the records of Ashurnasirpal. And it was from that stone on the left that I read the account of the results of a siege. He not only crossed rivers, but went across the mountains. People thought they were safe from the Assyrians, great mountain range, and he wouldn't be able to get his chariots over that. But then a shepherd comes running in and saying, the Assyrians are coming. The Assyrians can't. They can't get over the mountains. Patrol goes out to investigate, and in the distance they see the dust of masons at work, civil engineers at work, cutting away through the mountains. And so from this slab, for 6 days, in the midst of the mighty mountain of Qarqar, a difficult region not suited for the passage of chariots and armies, with hatchets of iron and axes of copper, I hewed a way through, I brought over the chariots and troops. The city of Qarqar, which is situated at the entrance at the path of the mountain of Matnu, I captured 700 of their warriors, I struck down with the sword. Their great spoil I carried off. 40 cities of the land of Dura I captured, and I slew their inhabitants. I carried off their spoil. The cities I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire. I departed to the city of Abaki, of the land of Qarqar. At my royal splendour, they were frightened, and their strong-walled cities they themselves cast down. To save their lives into the mighty mountain of Matna they went up. I marched after them. 1,000 of their fighting men I slaughtered in the midst of the steep mountain. With their blood I dyed the mountain. With their corpses I filled the gullies. 200 men I captured alive. I cut off their arms. 2,000 of them as captives I carried away. Their cattle, their sheep in countless numbers I carried off. 15,000 Arameans, ruled by Anuni Bali, I snatched away and brought to Assyria. Ashurnasirpal campaigned over the mountains to the east and then to the west, to the Canaanite towns of Tyre and Sidon, for the forests of Lebanon, for building work, his palaces and temples, and for the riches of the merchant cities of Tyre and Sidon. He came down the coast of Palestine into Philistia, and I'm sure that this must have terrified the Israelites. We get a reflection of it in the first book of Kings, chapter 16. In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Elah, the son of Baasha, to reign over Israel in Tirzah 2 years. Elah was king. Ashurnasirpal was on the march. The Israelites weren't keen on being led into battle by Elah. Just see why. His servant Zimri, captain of half his chariots, conspired against him as he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Asa, steward of his house in Tirzah. Zimri went in, smote him and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his stead. The Israelites weren't keen in being led into battle by an alcoholic. The king was trying to drown his worries and fears with drink. All right for the king, but it wasn't very encouraging for the people. And so this army commander, Tirzah, assassinated the king. And later on in the chapter, verse 16, the people that were encamped heard say, Zimri hath conspired and hath slain the king. Wherefore all Israel made Omri, the captain of the host, king over Israel, that day in the camp. And Omri went up from Gibbethon, and all Israel with him, and they besieged Tirzah. It came to pass when Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the palace of the king's house and burnt the king's house over him with fire and died. Omri was a wonderful military man, a very effective general. When he got control, the first thing he did was purchase the hill Shema and built the fortress city of Samaria, commanding the whole countryside. And so, in the Bible, reflection of Ashurnasirpal's campaigns, in the assassinations, and in the building of the fortress city of Samaria. Ashurnasirpal died, and so did Omri. Ashurnasirpal was succeeded by his son Shalmaneser, and Omri was succeeded by Ahab, the Israelite king. Here we have contact. On this stele of Shalmaneser III, we actually have the mention of an Israelite king by name. This is the 9th century BC, about 880 BC, 840 BC by now. Before reading and writing had even been invented, so the critics said. But here we have an Israelite king mentioned by name. But first of all, I'd like to give you a bit of local atmosphere. Shalmaneser's father, Ashurnasirpal, had come down the coast of Palestine as far as Philistia. The ambition was to get down the Jordan Valley, all the riches of the towns on the hinterland down the Jordan Valley, guarded by what's known in the Bible as the entering in of Hamath, passed through the mountains at Hamath. And Shalmaneser needed to defeat the armies before he could get down into Palestine itself. Against Aridi, the royal city of Ninu, I drew near. I stormed and captured the city. Multitudes of warriors I slew. His spoil I carried off. The pyramids of heads I erected in front of his city. Their youths and their maidens I burned up in the flames. Arzastiku, together with the cities of its neighbourhood, I destroyed, I devoured, I burned with fire. 4 pyramids of heads I erected in front of its gates. Some of its people I fastened alive to those pyramids. Others I hung up on stakes around the pyramids. And now to the Hamathites, to the cities of Holini, the Hamathite I drew near. The cities of Adenu, Baga, Agana, his royal cities, I captured, I set fire to his palaces. I departed to Qarqar, I drew near. Qarqar, his royal city, I destroyed, I burned with fire. And then Shalmaneser describes an alliance of Palestine nations that confronted him. Most of the nations of Palestine gathered together to stand against the Assyrians. Shalmaneser gives a table of the kings and the infantry, the cavalry, the chariots that he had to face. And in the alliance, we read 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers of Ahab the Israelite. And what a lot of insights that gives to us. One of the first things we read about Ahab was that he married the Zidonian princess Jezebel. And that was a great political alliance with Canaanites. And then when he fought against the Arameans of Damascus, we read that having conquered them, instead of slaying the king, he called him my brother and said, let's make a confederacy. And so we read on these 2 occasions of Ahab getting into the alliance with the other nations of Palestine. And then 10,000 soldiers, 2,000 chariots of Ahab the Israelite. Scholars aren't too happy with that. They think that 2,000 chariots must be a bit over the top and that the signs must have been misread. But if we take the Bible evidence as a whole, it's quite in context. Way back in Exodus, we read of 600 chariots. In Judges chapter 4, verse 3, 900 chariots of iron belonging to Jabin. 1 Samuel 13:5, 3,000 chariots of the Philistines. 2 Samuel 8:4, David captured 1,000 chariots of Hadadezer. 2 Samuel 10:18, 700 chariots. Further on in 1 Kings 4:26, Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses. And 1 Kings 10:26, we read about 1,400 chariots belonging to Solomon. And so the likelihood is that it really was 2,000 chariots of the Israelites, a vast, vast army. And it completely changes our attitude towards the Israelite culture. Instead of being nice, sleepy little villages with a few lads looking after the goats and maidens coming back from the well with a pitcher of water on their shoulder, industry, big industry, thousands of chariot wheels being made, a fords of Samaria turning out shift after shift, turning out all the things for the chariots. And then the horses had to be trained, all the backup equipment, mule carts, all the food, all the logistics had to be catered for. Let's see what happened at this great battle of Qarqar. He goes on after giving a list of the enemy he faced. 14,000 of their warriors I slew with the sword. Like Adad, that was their storm god, the equivalent of Baal, like Adad, I rained destruction upon them. I scattered their corpses far and wide and covered the face of the desolate plain with their widespread armies. I made their blood to flow down the valleys. The plain was too small to let their bodies fall. The wide countryside was used up in burying them with their bodies. I spanned the river Orontes as with a bridge. That was how Shalmaneser described a defeat. For in his later records, we read that he had 4 or 5 attempts to try and get into the Jordan Valley before he succeeded. One day, there was a knock on the palace door at Samaria. Jezebel did up her dressing gown and went to the door, came back, and said, Ahab, very strange looking fellow wants to see you. Smells a bit, dressed in skins. You ought to see his haircut. Don't like the look of him. Oh dear, Ahab put down his toast, went to the front door. There's Elijah. And Elijah, it's not going to rain until I say so. Good day, Your Majesty. Rain was Baal's job. The alliance of 12 nations of Palestine, every one of them would have been signed and sealed before Baal with the sacrifice of a prince out of the harem. And whole basis of the alliance was in honour of Baal. And here's Elijah saying it's not going to rain until I say so. An insult and a challenge to Baal. The drought came and the Lord told Elijah to go back and reveal himself once again to Ahab. 1 Kings 18 we read, Ahab called Obadiah, which was over the household, and Ahab said to Obadiah, go through the land unto all the fountains of water and unto all the brooks. Peradventure we may find grass and save the horses and mules alive, that we lose not all the beasts. Ahab's great security was in his vast chariot army. And when the drought came, that was a threat to his chariot army, and he was desperate to keep the horses and mules alive. And so as Obadiah went out looking for a bit of grass, Elijah met him and told him the drought was to end. A little later we read that Ahab and the Arameans of Damascus fell out, and there was war between Samaria and Damascus. The king of Damascus told his men to concentrate on the king of Israel and get him. But Ahab had gone into battle in disguise and they couldn't find him. The Bible says a certain man drew a bow at a venture and smote the king of Israel between the joints of his harness. He said to the driver of his chariot, "Turn thine hand and carry me out of the host, for I am sore wounded." The battle increased that day. The king was stayed up in his chariot against the Arameans and died at even, and the blood ran out of the wound into the bottom of the chariot, and one washed the chariot in the pool of Samaria. The dogs licked up the blood, and they washed his armour according to the word of the Lord. When Ahab had Naboth assassinated and stole his vineyard, then Elijah had promised this terrible doom upon him, and here it was fulfilled. And so Ahab perished in one of his chariots. The great security of Omri was the fortress city of Samaria. The great security of Ahab was his chariot army. And he perished in one of his beloved chariots. I don't know that Psalm 20 was directly inspired by those events, but it certainly reflects and illustrates them. The Lord answer thee in the day of trouble. The name of the God of Jacob set thee up on high. Send thee help from the sanctuary and strengthen thee out of Zion. Interesting thing is that out of the alliance of 12 nations that stood against the Assyrians, one is missing. Judah wouldn't join. They were looking for help from the God of Jacob. They were looking for help from the sanctuary, looking for God to strengthen them out of Zion. And then verse 7 and 8 of Psalm 20, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will make mention of the name of the Lord our God. They are bowed down and fallen, but we are risen and stand upright. And so here, the 9th century BC, according to the old scholars, before reading and writing was invented, and so all the Bible stories must be just campfire folk yarns. Here we have a contemporary account written at the time when Elijah was alive and actually mentioning by name Ahab, the king of Israel. We also have a pictorial record. These are fragments from gates of a temple known as the gates of Balawat. The Assyrians were very superstitious and set a great deal of store by dreams. And in one of the suburbs, Nineveh, there was a temple to a god Mamu, the god of dreams. I'm not quite sure of the technique, but perhaps the king or another wealthy worshipper went along and had a special supper of very special mushrooms and had the most amazing dreams. And the priests would consult the god and interpret the dreams. And Shalmaneser reckoned that the interpretation of his dreams by the god Mamu gave him the success in his campaigns. And in gratitude to the god, he set up some wonderful gates to the temple. And on the gates were embossed bronze bands illustrating events from his campaigns. The gates of Balawat were excavated by an Arab archaeologist called Rassam, who had been a friend and assistant to Henry Austin Layard. Now, Budge of the British Museum, he seems to have been able to accept a French or German archaeologist, might even have tolerated an American archaeologist. But as for an Arab as an archaeologist, it was too much for him. And he accused Rassam of stealing these bronze bands from a British Museum site. and he took Rassam to court. The evidence was heard, and the court found in favour of Rassam and awarded him damages. In Victorian coinage, he was given 1 shilling damages. And the remains of the gates were buried not in the sands of Mesopotamia, but in the basement of the British Museum. And there they remained forgotten until the 1950s, when the site was opened up again and studied, and Rassam was vindicated afresh as a reliable and conscientious, honest archaeologist. And as, I think, perhaps an act of remorse, the British Museum have made these replica gates and replica bronze bands. One of the bands shows us the Battle of Qarqar. And here is a chariot going into action. There are 2 chariot armies depicted on the bands, galloping towards each other, both dressed exactly the same. And the experts haven't been able to decide which were Assyrians and which were Palestinian alliance. But one of these, probably this one, almost certainly is Ahab the Israelite. He provided nearly 2/3 of the alliance's chariot army, and so you can be sure he had the honour of leading them. So not only do we have a contemporary written account of this Bible king, we have a picture almost certainly of Ahab the Israelite going into action with one of his chariots. This is a famous black obelisk. You'll see pictures of it in Bible commentaries and Bible dictionaries. It was one of the very early finds by Layard and was actually read in position by one of the team that deciphered cuneiform, the Irish clergyman Hincks. And it was the first long inscription to be deciphered from cuneiform. You can imagine how delighted Hincks was as he read on this stone the account of another Bible Israelite king. Here is a picture of Jehu paying tribute to Shalmaneser. The first thing that Jehu did when he came to power was, at the death of Ahab, he slew Ahab's son and 70 of Ahab's male children in his harem. The next thing he did was have Jezebel thrown out of the window and eaten by dogs. You can imagine what her family thought of that up in Sidon when the news came through. Must have made Jehu very popular with the Canaanites. A very interesting Bible precedent. He massacred the civil service. Lots of people would like to follow that example, but he massacred Ahab's civil service and so came to the throne with enemies all around. This Polaroid photograph taken by the court photographer at Shalmaneser was taken during the first 18 months of Jehu's reign, when he must have been very anxious indeed to have a few powerful friends behind him. And the caption says that Jehu, the king of Israel, actually it's called Bit Humriah, which means house of Omri, but it was the Assyrian name for Israel. Jehu, the king of Israel, paying tribute to Shalmaneser. This stone had a story of its own to tell, had adventures of its own. Along with Layard's other finds, it was loaded. First of all, it had to go down the fast-flowing Tigris on rafts, and some of the rafts were overturned and the finds were lost, and frequently they were shot at by local Arabs suspicious of what was going on. Eventually they got down to the Persian Gulf and the finds were loaded onto a British warship. The Suez Canal, of course, hadn't been opened by then, and so the warship had to go round Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. But in the Indian Ocean, it met with a typhoon and was dismasted and just managed to limp into Bombay. There, the Black Obelisk and much of Layard's other stuff was unloaded onto the quayside. The British colony in Bombay flocked to the quayside, turned over all Layard's stuff, anything that was small enough to carry away, they took to put on the mantelpiece, and Layard's priceless records were scattered to the winds. Back in London, Layard was chewing his fingernails to the elbows, desperate to get his stuff back again. Eventually, it was recovered, and after all its adventures, the Black Obelisk was here in the British Museum. The Bible says that Ahab had an ivory palace. Impossible. How could you have a palace of ivory? Probably whitewashed, and in the sun it looked an ivory colour. Ahab's palace has been thoroughly excavated, and the archaeologists found themselves shoveling up basket after basket after basket of carved ivory. Here are some examples of the ivory from Ahab's palace. Most anxious to keep Jezebel in the manner to which she'd been accustomed. And so Ahab's ivory palace was an ivory palace. This slide shows a copy of the Moabite stone. The original is in the Louvre. In 1868, a German missionary named Klein was told about the existence of this stone. He looked at it and noted a few words and reported it to the authorities, and the German authorities sent down to the village, offering the local people about £80 for the stone. But nothing happened. And a year or so later, a Frenchman, Clement Ganneau, heard that the stone was exposed to the weather and was being damaged by the weather. And so he sent some servants with instructions to make a rubbing of the stone and to offer the local people about £375 for the stone. The sudden jump in price grabbed everybody's attention, and they thought the stone must be very magic. The Turkish governor, he said he was going to have the stone. He was going to claim it for himself, obviously hoping to get even more money. The villagers were incensed, and they made a huge bonfire, put the stone on the bonfire, made it red hot, then poured water over it, smashed it to pieces. And each of the villagers took a little piece of the stone and put it in his barn to keep the mice and the mildew away from his grain. Poor Clement Ganneau, with a very red face and as much money as he could get together, went round the village from house to house, buying back pieces of the stone. He was only able to recover a little over half the stone, but fortunately his servants had made the rubbing, helped them to put the stone together, but also gave them a complete text. Moab, to the east of the Dead Sea, had long been Israelite territory, under Israelite control. And there was a chain of forts across the frontier between Moab and Israel. The account in the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 3 is mostly to tell us about Elisha the prophet, but it concerns the alliance between Judah and Israel in an attempt to reclaim Moab. And put off by the strength of the defences on the frontier, the Israelite Judean army went south round the bottom of the Dead Sea through the territory of Edom and attacked Moab from the south. And in 2 Kings chapter 3 we read first of all of that there in the blazing heat of the desert they ran out of water, and they asked Elisha what they should do, and he counselled them to dig ditches, and in the morning the ditches were filled with water. The Moabites, of course, had never ever seen any water there. When they looked out, they'd only seen the dry desert. But at the dawn, they looked out and they saw the red sky of the dawn reflected in the water. A complete surprise. And they said it was the blood of the Edomites that the Israelite Judean army had slain. And they were panic-stricken. And then 2 Kings chapter 3 tells us, when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too sore for him, he took with him 700 men that drew swords to break through even unto the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his eldest son that should have reigned in his stead and offered him for a burnt offering upon the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel, and they departed from him and returned to their own land. Celebrating that great victory, the Moabites set up this war memorial, and it's full of interest. First of all, it was written in Hebrew, quite a surprise. But then we remember that the Moabites were descended from Lot, and so the Moabites and the Israelites had a common ancestry. One of the problems in translating an ancient language is that some words are very rarely used, and so have a paucity of context to develop their meaning. If a word is used frequently, then the context every time it's used adds to the understanding of the word. But there was one word which caused great difficulty in translating the Old Testament, the word Arel. In Isaiah, it's translated half, and Jerusalem described as the Arel, or the half of God. It also occurs, interestingly, in the context of the Moabites. One of David's mighty men is said to have fought against the Moabites. Benaiah slew 2 lion-like men of Moab, and the lion-like men translates Arel. Professor Sayce, and later Albright, gave a much deeper understanding of the word. We've got 2 choices. It's either a half or it's lion-like. And they showed that it was an old Canaanite word that had come through Egypt, and it was a borrowed word, much as we use the word fiancé or rendezvous, French borrowed words, and it actually meant champion. And on this stone, it says how they slew the Arel of Israel before Chemosh, their god. And Arel, obviously, the correct translation, best translation, is champion. Roland Devaux shows that the practice of single combat as a way of resolving issues was much more common in the ancient world than is realized. David and Goliath, an example of the single combat. And the champion, the Arel, was the champion who went out in single combat to represent the nation. And that fits the passage in Isaiah and the David's mighty man. And so the stone has been very useful in providing additional context for doubtful words. But on the stone, and in the Bible account of the campaign, the great issue was water. And in the Bible we read how they stopped up the wells, and on the stone the Mesha, the king of Moab, commanded the people to dig fresh wells. And both in the Bible and on the stone, the final battle took place at Qarqar. That here in a little known backward part of the Middle East, no significance really to great international affairs, the people were so literally educated that it was quite ordinary practice for the king to set up a war memorial describing a victory for the local people to read. And so here in the 9th century BC, when according to the scholars, reading and writing was only just being invented, it was so common that there in Little Moab, the king was setting up war memorials for people to look at. Shalmaneser died with Assyria in rather a bad way. The Assyrian constitution wasn't very healthy. Assyria was divided up into regions which in fact were too large. They were so large that the ruler of each region was a potential rival to the king. And Shalmaneser's reign ended with civil war between the crown prince and some of these great warlords ruling over these overlarge regions. The Assyrians lost some of their military momentum, except for about 804 BC, when one king, Adad-nirari, defeated Damascus, and another king also had a campaign against Damascus and defeated it. This was very important for Israel because much of the first two books of Kings, we read about wars between Samaria and Damascus. And these frequent wars obviously undermined the economy, upset trade. Instead of farming, people were fighting and tended to keep the country poor. But when Damascus was defeated, then it gave the Israelites peace and quiet.